I will now take the sediment for this meeting of the Planning Committee held on the 6th of June 2023. The following members are present: Councillors Ali Callison, Ralph Barker, Arch Buchanan, Ross Clark, Jerry Convery, Margaret Cowie, Maureen Devlin, Mary Donnelly, Councillor Joe Fagan is not present. Fellow members are present: Councillors Gladys Ferguson-Miller, Elise Frame, Alistair Fulton, Shalene Handybod, Mark Horsham, Ross Lambie. We have apologies from Councillor Monique McAdams. The fellow members are present: Councillors Leslie MacDonald, David McLaughlin, Richard Nelson, Norman Ray, John Ross, Graham Scott, David Shearer, Helen Toner, David Watson, and Councillor Julia Mars is attending as a substitute. Thank you, and I'll pass you back to the Chair for today's business.
Thank you very much. Agenda item number 1, any declarations of interest? No declarations of interest. Agenda item number 2 is the minutes of the previous meeting submitted for approval as a correct record, pages 5 to number 10. Everybody agreed? Agreed. Agenda item number 3 is application P210929, development of 33 park homes with associated access road, landscape and ancillary office and community facilities in Waterlands Road and Law. And I'll ask Fraser to speak to this.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yes, this application seeks detailed planning consent for a development of 33 park homes on the site of a former tile works at Waterlands Road in Law. The tile works closed about 50 years ago, but is located in the green belt and is approximately 600 metres from the settlement boundary itself. A total of 132 objections were submitted in relation to the proposals, with a further 10 letters of support, and a summary of the representations are set out in section 5 of the report. While no objections were submitted in relation to the responses from statutory consultees, it is noted that requests for a range of conditions were sought should the Planning Authority be minded to approve this application. However, it is considered that the determining factors in relation to this application are its compatibility with the local and national planning policies. With regard to National Planning Policy 4, the application is contrary to Policy 8 in that it does not meet any of the criteria as set out in paragraph 6.5 of the report for an appropriate form of development in the green belt. In addition, the proposal is contrary to Policy 14, 15 and 16 of the National Planning Framework, given that it relates to a site outside the settlement boundary and does not connect readily to an existing community or services. It is also noted that the application will be contrary to Policy 4 of the adopted South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan, which states that development which does not require a countryside location will be expected to be located in existing settlements. The Local Development Plan also states that isolated or sporadic development will not be supported. The proposals are further contrary to policies GBRA 5, 8 and 9 of the South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan, and there is not considered to be any justification to merit a departure from the development plan. Therefore, for the reasons set out in section 7 and on page 22 of the report, the recommendation to committee is that this application should be refused.
Thank you, Fraser. I'll open up for any questions. Councillor Shearer.
Thank you, Chair. Not disputing or speaking for the pros or cons of this application. However, I would like to ask the planning officers present, this is, by their own admission, an ex-tile works. It's previously been used as a road haulage yard. So, albeit that it is in the green belt, it is a brownfield site. So, given that, we should be encouraging development of brownfield sites in the green belt rather than purely greenfield sites. What do the planners suggest would be appropriate on a site like this?
Happy to come back on that one, Councillor Shearer. In terms of the Greenbelt policy does look to promote development within existing settlements, and particularly residential development, so that there is a connection to local services, to local community. It promotes urban regeneration, and it effectively it creates new housing in areas where you would anticipate, where you would hope to see new housing creating, supporting settlements as it does along the way. In terms of the reuse of brownfield sites within the Greenbelt, it still stays, they are still in a Greenbelt area. Greenbelt doesn't necessarily mean that they are they are green. They may have had former uses on them, and sometimes the only use that's available around that might be to regenerate and go back to be a sort of natural vegetation, and that has happened over the decades since the Greenbelt policy has come into force. Within South Lanarkshire, though, we do have flexibility in terms of the range of uses that we would allow and we would accept within the Greenbelt. Some of those are actually picked up in papers that we've got to the committee today. But in that respect as well, I would point towards, there's Greenbelt policy GBRA 2, which talks about business proposals within the Greenbelt and rural area, which is acceptable. And that includes extension to rural businesses, includes agriculture, forestry, horticulture, and looks at recreation, tourism, holiday accommodation, leisure, sport and developments. It allows for farm diversification. It allows for existing traditional buildings being converted. It does allow for complementary farming activities. It does allow for agricultural engineering, contracting, repair of agricultural businesses, limited storage of buses and caravan storage, kennels, catteries. It's quite a significant list that does show that there is flexibility within Greenbelt locations. This proposal here is a residential development in a Greenbelt location, and that runs contrary to our own local development plan policy as well as with our national planning framework. But I wouldn't like to put the message across in terms of the Greenbelt is closed for development. There are a range of uses, and we are happy to talk to developers, landowners about suitable complementary uses or uses in the Greenbelt. This proposal, though, just for a residential use, it doesn't comply with policy, therefore the recommendation.
Supplementary.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Glad to hear your explanation of the Greenbelt and what is and what is not allowed, Fraser. However, this is still a brownfield site. It will never regenerate back to a field. Its basic underpinnings are type 1 aggregate, and it was like that when the haulage yard was there. So that's never going to go back to a field. So it's going to be necessary for, I would suggest that the planners lead this development in an appropriate way so that we get to a conclusion where development could go ahead on this site and others in the Greenbelt, or we are going to be left with a situation of having a lot of derelict sites that the department says no to. And I don't think that's what NPF 4 was envisaged for, or that any local plan is useful to. The answer's no. Now, what's the question? That's a wrong way to go forward with planning. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments? No. All members then happy to accept the proposals. The recommendation is to refuse detailed plan permission. I'll move that.
I'll second that.
Anybody otherwise minded? Agreed. Agenda item number 4. Application number P220737, and it's East Kilbride. I will ask Fraser to give this report.
Thank you, Chair. This application again seeks detailed planning consent, this time for 6 detached dwellings with associated access and infrastructure on a site that is located in the Greenbelt to the south of East Kilbride. The buildings on the site, which contained a former farmhouse and outbuildings, were in poor condition but have recently been demolished, and the proposal seeks to build 6 detached dwellings on this cleared site. The determining factors in this instance are the policies set out in the development plan, which is the national planning framework, as well as the adopted South Lanarkshire local development plan. In this context, the proposals are not required for any of the uses that are acceptable for development in the Greenbelt, and as such is contrary to policies 8, 14, 15 and 16 of the national planning framework. In a similar vein, While the adopted South Lanarkshire Development Plan does provide scope for a range of activities in the Greenbelt and rural locations, the proposed development of six detached dwellings would represent a form of isolated and sporadic development, and as such would be contrary to Policy 4 of the South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan. In addition to this, the proposal was also considered to be contrary to Policy 5, as insufficient information has been submitted to address concerns of the Roads Authority in relation to vehicular access. However, the determining factor here has been the fact that the proposal is contrary to Policy 4 in terms of the Greenbelt of the South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan. So therefore, for the reasons set out in Section 7 and on page 32 of the report, the recommendation to members is that application P220737 should be refused.
Thank you, Fraser. I'll open up for any questions or comments. Councillor Allison.
Just a piece of clarification. I think you've said that this site has already been cleared. Would it have made a difference to the deliberations if the planning process had started before the demolitions took place?
Yeah, but no, without predetermining the outcome of any planning application that could have come in, the Greenbelt policy does allow for the reuse of buildings on sites. It allows for extensions of buildings that are on the site. This proposal did relate to six new properties. But yes, if it had been a reuse of buildings, then that's something that the planning authority could look favourably on. I think something that we could comply with policy, but the situation we have just now is we have a cleared site. So effectively we have to take it as an application for six houses that don't have any specific location or need to be in that location in the Greenbelt.
So the conclusion from that is, like the last one, the site would be available for some sort of industrial business use, but not residential.
The site could be available for a range of uses, industrial, business, commercial, but something that's appropriate to a Greenbelt location. That's a matter we would happily discuss with the owner of the site. It would be a matter for the owner of the site to determine how they want to develop the site in partnership with us. But we would look to the reuse of these sites is something that we want to promote, and we do have policies that allow for that as well. It's the straightforward residential nature of this in the Greenbelt that would cause issues with the planning policy.
Thank you.
Councillor Watson.
Thanks, Chair. Be a bit confused by this one. I'm probably a bit along the lines of Councillor Shearer's point previously, that this is a site that's there, whether it's got redundant buildings on it or flattened. And when we talk about the Greenbelt, we talk about a big area of land, I'm presuming, but this is a pocket within that land that's already been developed. So I'm a bit confused that previously as well we approved house building on that site, and yet now we're saying we're not, and that wasn't against NFP, National Planning Framework 4, but you're suggesting it's against our own development plan as well, but we've already approved building on that site, the same number of houses, so a wee bit confused by that. And given the correspondence that we have had regarding pending introduction of sort of legal matters, would it be appropriate, and maybe as requested by the agent, for this to be continued? And maybe ask for your take on that, and if you could maybe address the previous comments as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yes, it is a Greenbelt site. As I say, the purpose of the Greenbelt isn't necessarily to sterilise every site for development. There are a range of uses that this site could be used for. The priority and the policies that exist within our own local development plan, as well as in the National Planning Framework, is to try and guide residential development to existing communities and existing settlements. There are a range of housing sites available in the local area within existing settlements, and that's where we would try to encourage new residential and almost new communities to be located. Regarding the previous consents that were issued for the site, I think that was a 2011 consent. It's been through 2 iterations of the development plan since that stage, as well as we now have the national planning framework as well. But I would suggest that in terms of the policy context around the importance of the Greenbelt, the importance of trying to encourage residential development into existing urban areas, that's a matter that's been tightened up through the local development plan process. So therefore, the policy context that existed in 2011 is different from what we're dealing with just now, nationally and locally. So this proposal, as we've said here, doesn't meet with the requirements of the South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan as well as the National Planning Framework. Regarding legal challenges, that's something that's always open to any applicant. We saw some correspondence on that. That's not the applicant could appeal this decision. They can challenge the validity of any document. But I'm unaware of what line that they are actually taking down that course. But that is certainly something that really sits with the applicant to pursue. I'm confident that in terms of the recommendation to the board today, the committee, it's something that is in line with our existing approved policies. And then, therefore, it would stand up to the scrutiny of an appeal. But certainly, and again, reiterating this matter, it's not about sterilising any site within the Greenbelt. We would look to work with landowners, with developers about potential uses, but they have to be compatible with a Greenbelt activity or required to be within the countryside. Okay, Councillor Watson.
I'm just trying to maybe get a steer on openness and transparency and cost to the council. Would it be possible to continue this? Is it worthwhile? Are we going down a rabbit hole, or do we leave it to going to appeal? Is there any merit in going either way? Sorry, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, obviously it's up to the committee, to kind of make a decision whether it wants to continue this application. My own sense in this is that the application is as presented and can't really be improved anyway. I really can't see how there's new information that would come in to justify the proposal in terms of our own local and national policies. Continuation would allow, let's say, additional information to be submitted, but I'm not aware that would be of a sort of form or content that would change the recommendation that's going to members today. But there is scope in terms of appealing decisions is open to any applicant on decisions that are made.
Councillor David Shearer.
Thank you, Chair. Given that there had been permission on this site before, and that in years gone by, this may well have been looked at as a cluster development where you reuse the buildings if you can, and if you can't, you demolish them, but you stay within the footprint of what was the previous buildings. I'm wondering what has dramatically changed that this suddenly becomes a refusal. And if it's NPF 4, again, I go back to what I said earlier, I don't believe that was the intention of NPF 4, was to stop any rural development or any housing in the rural area or Greenbelt. So, and honestly, there's been a request for this to be continued. I'd be happy to second any request for this to be continued until we get to a situation where sites like this are looked at on their proper merit, that you can't return that to a greenfield site. It is a former, there are buildings on the site within the near history, and this site should be reused, I believe. Chair, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Shearer. I think what Fraser's already said is that actually goes against our local development plan, which is contrary to our own policy, not just NPF 4, so it doesn't sit and fit in that context of it. And I spoke to Fraser at this at great length, so I'll ask Fraser just to come back in and that. I genuinely don't see the point in moving this to the next meeting, because they're going to come back with the exact same reason. Fraser's already said that it makes no difference if we postpone this. It's going to come back with the exact same. There's nothing else we can put in there, Fraser. I don't know if you want to add into that.
No, nothing much more to add. I don't know yet. fully confident that neither the National Planning Framework or our own local development plan is anything about stopping development and not having development in the Greenbelt or countryside. It's anything but that. It's just the nature of this proposal for 6 detached dwellings in a Greenbelt location, countryside location, with no specific locational need, no requirement to be in this on this site. It just doesn't conform with our local development plan policy. As I say, there was a decision in 2011, but there's been through 2 iterations of the local development plan since that stage, and the policy now is such that the policy 4 is very clear, as we would know that the South Lanarkshire Council does not promote sporadic and isolated development within the Greenbelt. 6 houses accessed along a fairly narrow track in a Greenbelt countryside location without a need to be there. It doesn't fit with our policy. And as I've said, we would be more than happy to have a discussion with the owner of the site around alternative uses that could go there. There are a range of alternative uses that we could put on the site, but I really can't see how this proposal as it stands, there can be any change to a recommendation that we would bring to the committee.
Councillor McLaughlin, and then I'll bring this matter to a close.
Thanks, Chair. It's in reference to Councillor Shearer suggesting that he would second any proposal to continue, but I don't think there was a proposal to continue. However, there was suggestions that we received by email suggesting we should continue, and I did read it vaguely, but not the whole document, not the whole email. In fact, there's been a couple of emails, and really my substantive point here, Chair, is we shouldn't be influenced by people and agents and applicants and their buddies writing to councillors who sit in the planning committee to try and influence decisions. We should be listening to officials, and I think the official has given a good report. And I'm quite happy with what I've heard. I don't believe anybody in the planning department would have any reason to refuse an application for any other reason other than what they've got in front of them as far as the legislation is concerned and NPF 4. So that really was my comment here. And on the back of that, excuse me, I wonder if there is anything that can be done to discourage applicants or their agents or anybody from lobbying, because basically it seems like that. Maybe it's not the right word, but writing to councillors who are on the planning committee, I think that's wrong. My own personal opinion, I think that's wrong. I started to read some of the emails, then I stopped reading them and I replied and asked them not to write to me again. But is there anything that we can do, is there anything you can do, Chair, that would discourage this type of behaviour? Because I certainly don't like it. And I wouldn't be influenced based on what somebody says to me in an email. I'll be influenced by what the officials tell me. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor McLaughlin. I have to agree, it certainly puts us in a position, especially when you sit on a live and under our code of conduct, it certainly puts us in a position if we had to ever respond to that. And I would urge that whoever does respond would have to declare an interest in this committee. Going forward, everybody has our email addresses which are open to the public. Therefore, it's impossible for us to stop that or cease it at any point. I get your point on it, and I do see it as lobbying to try and lobby the councillors. I go back to my original point is that under our code of conduct, we have to be very careful in what we respond to in a live report that's coming to this committee. And if they do respond to that by giving any indication, they must declare an interest. And it's not me, it's their decision. I can't tell you what to do. But again, that would be my point on it. I do take your point very, very clearly though. And I see the position that it certainly puts us in going forward. Yep.
Just for clarity, I'm not declaring an interest, and any replies that I sent to them was to ask them not to write to me.
No, I totally, I'm just saying in general, Councillor McLaughlin, I did see your response. I just didn't respond at all. As chair of the committee, it would not be right for me to do so. I did see your email. It was not you personally. I'm just saying in general for anybody who does respond to that in any matter of means, given any indication of how they would vote on here, then you would need to be very careful in what you're doing.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Any other further comments? If not, I would be happy. Sorry.
Comments on, and I agree with what David's saying regarding the emails, etc. I think this and the previous application worry me a wee bit the way that we are enforcing this, that I think none of us like seeing these sort of sites lying derelict, and I just don't know, are we being enforcing too much? And it'll be interesting to see how it all pans out with National Planning Framework 4, that with some of these developments in other areas. Because if we're not maybe a bit more lax, we're just going to be left with a lot of redundant sites throughout the authority. Sorry, it's just a comment rather than I'm not really expecting any response.
Thank you, Councillor. I think Fraser's already given an answer to that. That's not the position of this council. It's not the position of the administration either, that we make sites redundant. It has to fit within policy. There is other uses out there for Greenbelt sites that we can use it for, and it's about the agent working with the planning authority. As I said at the last meeting, things are working differently within the planning department. They are strengthening their team, and going forward, we are more strengthened, and there's more dialogue with the officers and the councillors. That also has to happen with the agents as well. They have to start speaking with the planners and trying to come to some recommendation. If everybody's happy then, if we all agreed, I'm happy to refuse detailed plan permission for the reasons stated. All agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed, thank you. Agenda item number 5 is application number P220967. Detailed plan application, Mulhugh Road in Stonehouse, and Fraser again, please.
Thanks, Chair. This application seeks planning consent for 3 residential plots on a site that sits within the Greenbelt between Stonehouse and Larkhall. It is accessed via a kilometre-long private road that serves 5 existing dwellings. No objections have been received following the period of statutory publicity, but it is noted that in relation to the statutory consultees, objections have been received from Nature Scott in relation to the potential impact on the adjoining special area of conservation and a site of special scientific interest. The Coal Authority have also objected to the proposal on the grounds that a suitable coal mining risk assessment has not been submitted. And finally, in relation to statutory consultees, the Council's Road Service have also objected to the proposal on the grounds that the proposed access to the site would not be satisfactory. In addition to the objections and recommendations for refusal, it is also noted that this proposal contravenes policies set out in the National Planning Framework, as well as the South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan. In this respect, as set out in section 6 of the report to members, the proposal contravenes policies 8, 9, 15 and 16 of the National Planning Framework, while at the same time they do not comply with the Council's adopted Local Development Plan, as it directly contravenes policy 4 of the LDP, which seeks to guide development to existing settlements and to resist sporadic development in the Greenbelt. The proposals are also not acceptable within the development management policies in terms of policy 5 of the South Lanarkshire LDP, as it would not integrate with an existing community and services and would create a development of 8 dwellings of a private access that could lead to issues at a future time for access and maintenance. Finally, the location of the proposals on the Clyde Valley Scenic Special Area of Conservation and the Avondale Site of Special Scientific Interest also brings the proposal into conflict with the natural and historic environment policies of our Local Development Plan. Therefore, in conclusion, it is recommended the application should be refused for the reasons set out in section 7 and page 44 of the report presented to members.
Thank you very much, Fraser. Open up for any questions or comments. No questions or comments. I would be happy then to refuse detailed plan permissions for the reasons stated. All agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed, thank you. Agenda item number 6. Page 47, application P221053, and it's a land adjacent to Stony Meadow Cottage in East Kilbride. And I'll ask Fraser again.
Thanks, Chair. This application relates to a site located in the Greenbelt, for which consent is sought for a 1.5-storey dwelling house on an area of land that is currently planted with regenerated trees. This application has been brought to the committee following a request from an elected member, as it would have been appropriate for a decision on this application to have been made by officers within the context of the Council's approved scheme of delegation. As with previous applications that have been presented to the committee today, this proposal needs to be assessed against the relevant policies in the National Planning Framework and Local Development Plan, And for the reasons set out in section 6 of the report, it is considered that they do not comply with the local and national policy context. The proposal to erect a single house in this greenfield and green belt location cannot be justified in terms of a number of national planning framework policies, but in addition to this, it is also contrary to policy 4 of the South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan. There is no specific locational need for a dwelling to be located at this site. The proposal also throws up practical issues in relation to access, sight lines and the loss of trees and woodlands, but notwithstanding this, it is considered there is no justification for a departure from policy. It is noted that elected members have been contacted in recent days by the agent supporting the applicant on this matter, and in this respect it is further suggested that no new or relevant matters have been brought to the attention of the planning service, and this being the case, the recommendation to members is that this application should be refused for the reasons set out in section 7 and pages 55 and 56 of this report.
Thank you, Fraser. Any questions or comments? Councillor Scott.
To Fraser for his report. Obviously, similar to David Watson and David Shearer in the previous applications, I'm unhappy with the way this application has been done in a matter of a few aspects here. One, Mr. Bell and his representative were told by an officer that consent would be recommended. There's a genuine belief that there was an inordinate delay in processing this. Therefore, the application drifted over the 13th of February precipice, which is the NPF 4, and this application was then deemed to be a refusal. Obviously, Mr. Bell, and I've spoken, Mr. Bell obviously is happy for me to say at committee today that Mr. Bell is now living in a caravan because of the delays and the time pressures of selling his previous dwelling. He had to sell his house, and on the basis of that, he was going to get consent for his new home to be built down at Stony Meadow Road. And then obviously the 13th of February happened. It turned into a refusal. And I say Mr. Bell and his young family are now living in a caravan. I don't think that was the way NPF 4 was, the precipice that was brought in. The Scottish Government, and I'm blaming the Scottish Government here, that it should have been a graduated way to bring NPF 4 in. I feel so sorry for Mr. Bell and his family that they've been put in this position. And I know from Fraser from previous about the case law. I think case law is going to have to build up about NPF 4. And it wouldn't surprise me if this one ended up at the Reporters Unit in Edinburgh and this reservoir of case law around NPF 4. I understand officers taking the strict response to NPF 4. But I think in circumstances like this, I think it's very unfortunate for the applicant that he's been put in this position. And obviously, Fraser's comments about the delays in processing this application, I'd be very interested in. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. Just to make it perfectly clear, NPF 4 was used as part of the recommendations that we have in front of us, but also didn't fit with our local development plan. So although NPF 4 was used, it still didn't fit with the local development plan. But I'll ask Fraser to come in on that.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And the planning application, has been sitting, before bringing it here to the committee. There was a range of consultee responses that we needed to get. There was information that we needed to get from the applicant and via their agent. That's what led to some of the delays in terms of bringing it here to committee. In terms of informal conversations that may have taken place or did take place with officers, I think at the end of the day, though, I think we have to recognise that there is no decision made on a planning application until a decision notice is issued or the report is brought here to the committee. I think there's always careful in terms of officers will look to work positively with applicants. They'll look to have a constructive discussion with them. They'll look to guide them in every way that they can. But if that gets interpreted in terms of an officer has then issued the approval, then that's not something that we can deal with. Officers are very clear in terms of any of the advice that they're giving to people is that It has to be just informing them about the process that is going through, but an officer in their own self cannot make decisions. And a decision isn't made until it comes to committee or is approved through the delegated authority. One issue in terms of with agents and in terms of with delays in applications, there is opportunities that they can appeal for non-determination. That wasn't the case with this particular application here. In terms of the national planning framework, it was trailed. It was trailed through Parliament. It was trailed through, there was drafts of the national planning framework prior to its imposition in February 23rd. Yes, that date didn't come in other building standard regulation does tend to come in with a period of grace, but the policy did apply from February 23rd, but it was, the details and the content of it was trailed through parliamentary debate. But picking up again in terms of what the convener and Councillor Nelson had said there, the proposal is also contrary to our local development plan policies, and hence the reason that the recommendation is here today. Finally, absolute sympathy in terms of the applicant in the situation they find themselves in. More than happy to have a discussion about is there any way that we can support them as a council, as a planning service, but this development as it stands has to be treated on its merits in land use planning concerns, and that means it refers to the land itself and not the individual circumstances of the applicant. But we do have absolute sympathy for the situation that Mr. Bell currently finds himself in. And if we can find some sort of solution around it, we would be happy to kind of have that discussion. But I don't see how that can be on this particular site here.
Thank you, Fraser. I think to reiterate that point is the consideration for Mr. Bell, and I'm sure that this council will stand ready to help him if he requires help. Councillor Shearer.
Thank you, Chair. On a general point, I'd like to ask Fraser, is there any scope to deal with applications that were lodged well in advance of the February deadline for NPF4 to be looked at slightly more sympathetically, given that they were in the system, they were working their way through the system, and we could equate them to the policies that were before the NPF4 deadline? Because it does appear, Chair, that NPF4 is paralysing our planning department to say, no, refuse everything that's coming forward. And I really think there should be some scope to look at applications that were lodged before the deadline and look at them sympathetically. Thank you, Chair.
I think Fraser can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the Scottish Government that decided, not us, that superseded everything else. But given that this particular item and some of the other items before us didn't sit with our local development plan anyway, it wouldn't have mattered if NPF4 came in, because it still didn't fit with the local development plan. But going back to the original point, NPF4 was put into us by the Scottish Government. We didn't decide. They decided. I'll ask Fraser just to come in on that point.
Yeah, in terms of applications that that were submitted prior to February, the 23, and as I say, with the applications that are here, each of these has been assessed against the local development plan, and that's been a determining factor. The NPF4 has just been another ancillary factor. It's added a bit of strength to some extent towards our own Greenbelt policy and the implementation of it, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not something that, these are decisions that would have come to this committee, irrespective of whether national planning framework was in place or not. They are proposals that don't fit with South Lanarkshire's local development plan policy. More than, as I say, happy to talk about other proposals that could fit with policy. But as it stands, the national planning framework and LDP that we have here in South Lanarkshire both would go against a proposal of this nature.
Councillor MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. I know that this planning application was lodged in 2022. So if that's the case, why, and it's contrary to the local plan as you're stating, why would an officer not have advised Mr. Bell of this situation, the fact that it's contrary to the local plan? Why would he wait until, this is what, June? Why would he wait till now and obviously put him in? I don't know, I'm listening to what Councillor Scott has said. He must have had some thoughts that it was going to be successful, because why would you go and sell your house and do, that's a drastic move in the hope that you're going to get planning, and your planning is going to be approved. So why were they not told in the first instance, that's my question, that this breaches our local plan? Thank you.
Yeah, within the context of advice that's given at a pre-application stage, I think there can be. I think the comments and observations that are made by officers to agents can sometimes be misinterpreted. And I think in terms of from officers themselves, they may find it, and did possibly find it, a bit difficult to say to an agent that a development would be unacceptable. The danger with that being unacceptable is the person can then effectively challenge the officer and say, how can you prejudge the outcome of a planning application? So I think actually, and it's not a criticism about officers, and I would defend them to the professionalism that they deliver in working with people. I think in hindsight, probably we could have been stronger in terms of what applications that are coming forward of nature would not be acceptable, but they have sought to do it within the context of, let's see, is there any way we can make this better? Is there any way we can make that proposal better? Unfortunately, if someone then has taken that as a green light for go and have sold their house or have started the development, then that really was not a matter that that can be held against the planning service or held against officers. I think moving forward, given a strong Greenbelt policy in our LDP as well as with the MPF, it does provide us with absolute certainty in terms of what South Lanarkshire Council's position is in dealing with proposals of this nature. Our officers can then be quite strong in terms of the advice that they're given to applicants so that they don't go down this line of expense. But we are still going to get people coming forward with proposals that, irrespective of the advice that they get given for officers, they'll want to see it. They'll want to see it going through the due process. But that's not something that we can't stop people making applications on things. So I think in terms of the decisions that are made today, it does show that we are implementing our Greenbelt policy, and that's something that will be reflected in the advice that our officers can give in future.
Thank you, Fraser. Councillor Allison?
Yeah, Fraser, understand a lot of what you're saying there. I think that, and I apologise, this isn't specific to the application we're talking about just now, but more in general. I think there are three things that I've seen come out through this. First of all, it's the importance of pre-app talks, and therefore some of the discussions we've had previously about the change to that system need to be considered very carefully, because I think there is a role for them, and if we start and change that, it will lead to more issues rather than less. And it's how you phrase within these pre-app talks. You're quite right. Nobody, until this committee sits, can decide on an issue. But being able to give advice as to the areas that need to be addressed, I think, is very important. And whether you could go as far as to the likelihood or what length they would need to go to be able to do that would be very important, because being able to stop people spending a lot of money and putting an application forward that won't comply with policies, whether it's NPF4 or local, is understood. Another issue that seems to be raised through this is the time that some statutory consultees get to respond, because that seems to be, putting it bluntly, clogging up the whole planning system. And is there nothing we can do to free that time up by limiting the time? Are we allowed to do that they have to respond, so that we're not having some applications sitting for months before the planners can get the relevant information to make a recommendation? And finally, is there any grey areas within the implementation of MPF4? Because there seems to be some suggestion that other councils are finding different ways to handle these. Are we being over strict?
Yeah, in terms of the pre-application discussions, we are one of the authorities that don't charge for pre-application discussions. A lot of authorities do. There's a big authority nearby that charges thousands to talk to a planning officer about any proposal. And I kind of feel as if the advice that we can offer professionally is helpful to applicants, but at the end of the day, the decision needs to come into a public forum through the formality of a planning application, and that's when the decision can be made. I would be a bit reticent about prejudging the outcome of a planning application at that pre-application stage, because I think that's undermining the role of you as the planning committee. as well as the delegated authority that sits within myself and with the director as the head of planning. In terms of but I do agree that it is very important that our officers are given robust and good advice to agents and applicants when they come forward to try and save them as much money as possible. We had a forum last week with local agents. We actually held it in the townhouse, and it was about let's get a good, positive and constructive discussion. There was we want to engage with agents, find out what their concerns are, what their challenges. We will be able to reflect some of that through the next iteration of the local development plan, so that we are meeting the needs of the development community as well as applicants across South Lanarkshire. So that will all come into part of our operations through policy review as well as pre-application discussions. In terms of consultees, I would possibly say in the past we have been guilty of waiting for a consultee to come back for a response that actually wasn't going to change the outcome of the application, and that's been the case with some of the applications that are with us today. We have waited for responses, whereas we could have just refused it a number of months ago in terms of our own LDP policy and recently with the National Planning Framework as well. I think the holding out for an objection that's not going to change something doesn't really help, but a lot of applicants and agents would rather get that belt and braces just in case it is something that brings something new to the party. But my sense is it's better to deliver bad news quickly rather than putting somebody to the expense of trying to make something that's never going to be approved acceptable. So I think that's something we'll work with agents around. We are working closely with our colleagues within the road service, within our own environmental health service as well, working with them to respond. Agencies like SEPA, Nature Scotland and the like as well, we are meeting with them. I met with SEPA last week, telling them about some of the issues that we have around that. So it's trying to speed them up, because at the end of the day, we want to deliver a good service to our applicants as well as to you as the planning committee. Regarding National Planning Framework 4 and its implementation, I'm on the executive group of Heads of Planning Scotland. I'm in contact with Heads of Planning every day. There are different policy contexts in terms of how certain areas are, their own local development plan and how they define development within their area. But there is a unanimity in terms of how National Planning Framework is being implemented. So how we are delivering it within a green belt location is different from how it's being delivered in some areas of rural Scotland, where there are, in terms of within Highlands or rural Perthshire, Angus and the like as well, they have a different. An NPF has a different policy implementation than you do here within the central Scotland. In terms of National Planning Framework as well, there is also there is guidance that still needs to come forward. Some of that guidance though relates to issues around health and well-being, energy management, the issues around how we would look for energy assessments. And there matters when the guidance comes through, they will allow us to make decisions based on some of those elements of National Planning Framework. As it stands just now, things like Policy 8, which are in the Green Belt, they are clear-cut. It's a clear view that complements our own local development plan, and therefore that's the reason these decisions have came to the committee today, are these recommendations.
Thank you, Fraser. Councillor Suppler, quick supplementary. If there's anybody else looking to come in, I've got Councillor Lambie, then I will bring this one to a close.
Yeah, Fraser, there's something you said there that there has been a different way of implementing in Highland, Perthshire, Highlands, etc. Within South Lanarkshire, we have a very varied geographic constituent. Clydesdale's completely different to some of the urban areas. Does that mean we will be implementing NPF 4 in different ways in South Lanarkshire?
In terms of South Lanarkshire, we have over 100 settlements. There are a range of settlements, all of which will need to be reviewed within the context of the next local development plan, and that needs to also reflect what's in the National Planning Framework itself. That might lead to some settlements that would be expanded. Some of them may not actually merit the justification of being a settlement, but what we want to make sure is we are attracting development to the appropriate locations. So through the next iterations of the local development plan, that will allow us to make sure that we have policies in place that allow us to implement what NPF 4 is about, and what our own local development plan about is promoting rural regeneration, rural development, but in the appropriate locations. How we apply the NPF through our planning applications now is set within the NPF and the LDP. But obviously the LDP will be subject to review, and we'll be bringing that back through changes to residential design guides, changes in terms of how we have our settlement boundaries, overall policies, how we're going to promote rural regeneration as well. And that's why I can only encourage members in the communities that you represent to get involved in the local development plan process, because that will then be effectively the flavour for South Lanarkshire of what's reflected there in the national planning framework as well. But we are consistent with the plan just now, and as a planning authority we need to be consistent with the plan. We can't really act in isolation. It then leaves us open to making what I would suggest could be perverse decisions that are contrary to our existing policies.
Thank you. Lastly, Councillor Ross Lambie.
You're answering a lot of questions this morning. It's much appreciated. On the MPF4 thing, I guess for any individual or company approaching a development, they kind of need legislative clarity of the environment they're going into. So if you take building control, for example, when you submit your building control notice, the regulations at that point in time is what you have to deliver on site, and any new regs that come in later don't count, which is really important because they could have big financial implications on any project. So with the planning, I kind of assumed that it would have been the same thing, that any application prior to MPF4 just get purely determined on the legislation at the time, which I understand is actually the case, that we're the applications we're refusing today or talking about are being refused based on the local plan, which is correct, but maybe just simply the mentioning of the MPF4 and the reasoning in the reports is kind of muddying the water. So I just kind of, is it true that my assumption that any application prior to MPF4 gets determined on the legislation at that time? Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor. In terms of the building regulations, yes, there have been changes to building regulations over the years, and what there tends to be is a period of grace where there would be, this legislation will be implemented on August 1st. What we then tend to find is you get a whole glut of applications that come forward at that stage in order to get in front of the improved or reviewed standards. In terms of the national planning framework that was approved by Scottish Parliament, it was effectively all applications that were in the process or were in the system at that stage that hadn't been decided must then be decided within the context of the national planning framework as well as our own local development plan. If and these applications had only been considered within the context of the local development plan, that still would trump our local development plan. And I think that could bring us into potential conflict. But our applications actually fall down in terms of our own local plan policy as well. So I think we need to refer to the national planning framework because it's part of our development plan. The regional plan has disappeared on the back of with the new MPF coming in. So our two policy contexts is the MPF and our local development plan. And we have to make reference to both in terms of our decision-making process. So I think in terms of the idea that this has all just been implemented because of national planning framework, I don't agree that's the situation. This is us effectively implementing the policies that exist within our own local development plan, but also being consistent with the national plan as well.
Thank you, Fraser. If there's no further questions or comments, I would then propose the recommendation that this application is refused for the reasons attached.
I'll second it.
Everybody agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item number 7, page 59. It's application P221178 and it's Milton Road, Kirlook. Fraser?
Thanks, Chair. This application relates to a site within the Greenbelt, southwest of the West Coast Main Line, outside the settlement boundary of Kirlook. Planning permission is sought for a detached 1.5-storey dwelling, which would be accessed from the private road that leads from Milton Road and which serves 3 existing traditional cottages and a modern development that replaced former stables. It is noted that following a site visit by officers, that work has commenced on the dwelling for which consent is sought, while a further 4 chalets have also been constructed and appear to be occupied. Enforcement proceedings have been instigated in order to address the potential breaches of planning controls that may have taken place. However, with regard to the proposal that is currently before members, it is noted that the determining issue in relation to the proposals are its compliance with National Planning Framework 4 and the Local Development Plan. And in this respect, it is considered that the proposals do not comply with a number of national and local policies, and to this end, the application is contrary to policies 8, 14, 15 and 16 of the National Planning Framework. Over and above this, policy 4 of the adopted South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan states that development, which is not required to be located in the Greenbelt, will be expected to be located within settlement boundaries. As such, the proposals are contrary to policy 4, as well as policies GBRA 5, 8 and 9 of the South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan. We are aware that members will have been contacted by an agent acting in relation to the proposal, but having assessed the issues raised, it is considered that no new considerations have been presented to the Planning Service that would merit a departure from the approved and adopted policy documents. Therefore, for the reasons set out in section 7 and page 68 of today's papers, the recommendation to members is that this application should be refused.
Thank you, Fraser. I'll open up for any questions or comments. Councillor David Shearer.
Thank you, Chair. Yet again, we have an application which was lodged well before the February deadline and took some lengthy time to determine. And there's issues there that Fraser has addressed already, and I think he needs to address them further within the department, not with it before this committee. My main reason for saying that this application should be granted is there was a building on this site right up until September 2021. And surely this is a brownfield site, again, within the Greenbelt, and it is more acceptable to use that brownfield site. I would also like to remind the committee, the chalets that are there illegally have nothing to do with this application. It's a different builder or applicant, however you want to phrase that, and it should not be conflated together. And for that and other reasons, I am moving that this application be granted. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Shearer, have you got a seconder? Councillor Frame online. Councillor Frame.
Hi, I was just wanting to second David Shearer's proposal there, if nobody else has seconded it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll open it up to see if there's any other questions or comments, and then we'll bring that to any other questions or comments. Okay, it is my decision to propose that we refuse detailed plan permission as per the recommendation.
I'll second it.
And we have an amendment from Councillor Shearer, seconded by Councillor Elsie Frame. Councillor Shearer, in your proposal, can I just ask for a planning reason of the deferment or going away from the actual recommendation? Just to check, are you moving then that we move, you're moving contrary to our local development plan? There is a...
I'm moving it contrary to the recommendations, yes.
Which is moving against the local development plan.
My interpretation of the local plan is this is a brownfield site and should be developed. The planning department's interpretation is obviously different, and they're entitled to their decision, and I'm entitled to my motion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Shearer. Just so we have it perfectly correct on the paperwork, and then we don't need to come hunting for you afterwards.
Councillor Shearer, can I just clarify as well, you happy that it's would be subject to appropriate conditions drafted by officers?
Okay, I've got two councillors wishing to speak, and then we are going to go to the vote. So I'll come to Councillor Mary Donnelly online first.
Just clarification about the brownfield site. Could the officer talk me through that? Are they saying it's not a brownfield site?
Yeah, the site of the proposed, there was a building that sat to the front of the proposed development site, but the area where the majority of the site was actually trees and a planted area. There was a former works on the site at a number of decades in the past, and that's what the three cottages that are effectively across the track are related to that. But this site here, there was a building on the site, but the proposed site for the dwelling actually sits within an area that had been planted, and there's trees on that just now. So I think it's defining it as a brownfield site, I think is questionable. There is an element that may have been built at some point in the past, but there is certainly the majority of the site was trees and would effectively be a greenfield site.
Councillor MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just have some clarification, please, that it is what we're going to vote on is solely for the erection of dwelling house at plot, whatever, 3-1 Milton Cottage, and it's nothing to do with any other buildings that Fraser mentioned? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. It's only for the recommendation of plot 3, land 50 metres southwest of Milton Cottage and Milton Road. Okay, I will go to I'll ask Stuart just to make sure we're ready, and then we'll take it to the vote.
Thank you, Chair. I've got to start voting button on this. Sorry for the delay. The vote is now running. If you could please, sorry. I should really go back over what we're voting on, shouldn't I? Apologies. So the motion is to refuse plan permission for the reasons detailed in the report, which has been proposed by Councillor Nelson and seconded by Councillor Convery. The amendment is that planning permission is granted on the grounds that it's a brownfield site and should be developed. And this would be subject to appropriate conditions drafted by officers. That's been proposed by Councillor Shearer and seconded by Councillor Frame. The vote is open. If you could please indicate your preference. Thank you. Right, okay, the vote seems to have locked. We'll stop that vote and we'll start another one. I'll let you know when we're ready. It should be okay. Yeah. Okay, the vote has been reopened. If you could please indicate your preference. Okay, can I just check if everybody's voted? It appears that 2 members haven't cast their vote yet. Okay, we're still 1 vote short. If everybody's indicated a preference. Okay, thank you. Everybody's now cast their vote. 15 members have voted in favour of the motion and 9 members have voted in favour of the amendment. I therefore declare the motion carried. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Agenda item number 8. Councillor McLaughlin.
Chair, it's in relation to the 4 chalets that was mentioned in the previous report. They're not connected with the application, I believe, but if they're there and they don't have planning consent, is there any action being proposed to address that?
So there is ongoing discussions with our legal department.
Thank you.
Sorry, agenda item number 8 is page 71 in your pack, application P221247, and it's in Flemington Road in Cambuslang. Fraser?
Thanks, Chair. This application relates to a site that sits immediately out with the settlement boundary in the green belt at Flemington Road in Cambuslang. The applicant is seeking consent for a change of use from an agricultural field to a landscaping yard and plant nursery orchard with a maximum of 2 shipping containers for storage. The proposals will see the area fenced off, used for growing trees and materials associated with a landscape business. No objections have been submitted from statutory consultees, although 17 objections were submitted raising issues that are summarised in section 5 of the report. It is noted that a number of objections were raised following an unauthorised site start and the removal of a bridge parapet that provided the frontage to the site. This matter is being addressed by the Roads Authority, and while no long-term damage has been made to the road itself, it is noted that discussions are ongoing around the materials removed. In relation to planning considerations, national and local development plan policies do allow for uses in the Greenbelt that support horticulture and landscaping businesses. Similarly, policies in relation to business and industry do allow for uses such as that proposed in this application to operate from Greenbelt locations, subject to detailed assessment of their impact on the surrounding area. In this context, in order to provide adequate controls over the operations at the site, a number of conditions have been suggested that cover matters such as access, parking. In addition to this, the consent is only given for a temporary period and for the benefit of the applicant to allow the council an opportunity to monitor activity. Therefore, it is considered that this proposal is acceptable and for the reasons set out in section 7 of the report and subject to the conditions set out on pages 79 to 83, it is recommended that this application should be approved.
Thank you, Fraser. I will open up for any questions or comments. Councillor Alistair Fulton online.
Morning, everybody. Yeah, I've just got a couple of questions for this. Two of them you've already answered, so thank you for that. I'm looking at the site layout of the proposals on the planning portal, and I'm looking at the proposed access to it. Now, at one side, we've got a 10.5 radius display, which is fine for vehicles turning in, but at the opposite side of the access, we've only got 1 metre access radius display. It looks a bit tight for vehicles turning left onto Flemington Road. And also, has there been a swept path analysis undertaken to make sure that geometry of the access is fine and the vehicles entering the site do have the room to manoeuvre? Sorry, I've just finished with speaking there.
Thanks, Councillor. In terms of this particular access arrangement, it's one that we've discussed with the applicant, and it's to encourage right turning traffic only, so that most of the vehicles leaving the site don't turn left.
How are you going to, sorry for jumping back in there, but how are you going to control that then? Because, drivers are drivers and you can't control somebody that wants to turn right. What they could possibly then do is go into the right-hand lane, to get a better swept path round to turn left. It's quite a narrow road, Flemington Road, and it just seems that it could possibly lead to sort of bottlenecks there. You've not actually answered if there's been a swept path analysis undertaken.
I'll ask Stuart just to confirm. Stuart?
Thanks, Chair. In terms of the swept path, it's not something that we have asked to be submitted, but I can advise that with the geometry that's proposed to the right, we're confident that the vehicles can turn right. In terms of where vehicles are likely to be travelling, we do anticipate that most of those will be turning right out the site, and by making the geometry tighter to the left, then as I said earlier, it's to discourage that left turning traffic.
Sorry, I'm if I appear to be labouring the point, but I'm familiar with the area, and I know that these areas are getting busier and busier. The residential developments to the west of the site. What size of vehicles are coming in here? On the plan, it's just showing sort of typical cars and the such like. But if it's a yard for horticultural, we'll be looking at trucks, fairly large trucks coming in there, and I just feel that the site's a bit tight for that, and I think I'm hesitant to agree to this until we can see a swept path analysis to show that this site is actually workable for vehicle access and egress.
Thanks, Councillor Filton. I believe that they're not expecting a huge amounts of traffic. It will be trucks that will come in and out at various times, so not a large amount of traffic. Do you want to come back in, Fraser? No.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chair. Yeah, there is quite an extensive list of conditions that we've attached to the proposal, because effectively, I think we know that we're concerned in terms of there would be a suggestion that this could suddenly move towards something that would generate a lot of traffic, introducing retail uses, introducing members of staff who would be coming and going, and also members of the public as well. The controls that we've looked to put in place through conditions will really limit this to what has been suggested to us is going to be the use, which is effectively planting trees, that every so often a vehicle would be coming and moving them off site to somewhere else. The storage that's on site is for tools that you would associate with something that is for, again, for planting trees, as well as a welfare block as well. We are not anticipating that there will be a significant amount of traffic that will be generated by this use, but hence the reason why the temporary consent that will allow us to monitor the activity. Also in terms of the restriction, in terms of the uses that can take place on the site as well. So that being the case in terms of looking at the size geometry of the site, and the use is acceptable within this as a greenbelt location, but putting these controls in place hopefully ensure that the impact on traffic safety as well as the residents that will be on the site that's being developed on the other side of the road as well, that will be taken into consideration. If the proposal and the uses are unacceptable, then obviously the consent is there for a limited period of time and wouldn't be continued. So that hopefully, if that gives any reassurance, Councillor, is that we have sought to put these measures in place to minimise the negative impact that could come from this use. But the hope is that this use will be quite minimal, and as I say, it's effectively tree planting on a landscaping yard.
Thank you, Fraser. Councillor Mary Donnelly online.
What is the time scale that we're putting in as a pilot that Fraser mentioned?
Yeah, it's a 3-year consent is what we're looking at here. So it's 3 years, which allows the business to get established, see how they operate as well, and gives us that control where if it's unacceptable, that then the use can there. And this is where the use may revert back to a traditional sort of not greenfield activity, or it may be some other sort of greenfield activity. What we have to be careful here is we're not opening the door to a proposal that, again, should be within the urban area.
Thank you, Fraser. Any further questions or comments? No further questions or comments. I will then grant detailed plan permission. I'll move that.
Second it.
Any others agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item number 9, page 85 in your pack, is application P221463, Lynch Homes Limited, Newhouse Road, East Kilbride. And I'll ask Fraser again to present this item.
Thanks, Chair. This application relates to a site within the East Kilbride Community Growth Area, and it seeks consent to discharge condition number 1 of the consent that was granted under an application approved in 2018. And this would allow the construction of 50 detached dwellings. The proposal has been assessed within the context of the National Planning Framework and Local Development Plan, and there is no conflict with either document. No practical issues have been raised through the statutory consultation process that cannot be addressed by the conditions that have been imposed on this in the paper that's presented today. It is also considered that in relation to the letter of representation which expressed concern over path networks, that the overall master plan for the community growth area does provide access to a range of open spaces and is therefore consistent with the relevant planning policies. So therefore, subject to the conditions on pages 93 to 97, it is recommended this application should be approved.
Thank you, Fraser. I open up for any questions or comments. Councillor David Watson.
Thanks, Chair. A couple of comments, and if you indulge me, not directly at this specific, but directed at the community growth area. I've raised this before, and this is again another tranche of housing coming into the community growth area, and the whole area is now growing apace, and yet we're still looking for safe crossings on Eaglesham Road, which is part of the overall master plan for the area. And I know I keep getting told they're coming. They're tied in with the community growth area. They're tied in with the new transport interchange that's going to hopefully appear for the new Hairmire station. But as we sit here just now, there's more every day. There's houses getting completed, people moving into houses, and yet there's still issues about safe crossing, getting onto Eaglesham Road, getting up to Greenhills Road, Redwood Crescent, etc. That needs to happen, and it needs to happen soon. We can't just keep ploughing more and more houses in there. And I'm just putting it out there, and I say it's a plea really that something needs to happen before there's a serious accident. And another point is, again, covering probably the whole of the community growth area and other areas in that area. A big issue that's developing is identifying who the factors are for areas. And is there any way that the planning department or any other department can try and keep a master record of factors? I don't know how many times I've been chasing about trying to get factors for areas, and it just seems an awful lot of waste of time if we had a master record somewhere that you could just go, right, that street that's factored by such and such, But and this is such a big area, it would be helpful in the future, I think. Thanks.
Fraser.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. I think the comments about the traffic safety and the increase of sort of people living within the area, I think they're well placed. I think we can take that on board. We'll work with colleagues in roads, looking to to deliver these requirements and essential infrastructure as early as we can. We can provide an update on that in terms of timetables, if that's okay. Looking at issues around factors, the challenge with that is it's with each individual developer, they sometimes have their preferred factor or landscaper that they look to work with. I'm not aware if we have a list of the factors for the community growth there. And the looks of blankness I'm getting from colleagues is probably that isn't the case. But I think it would be something that would be helpful for us as a local authority to have that list. We can contact each of the individual house builders and ask who they've got. Obviously, in terms of each of the people who have bought their individual houses, they should have a record of who their factor is, and there'll be a legal contract that they're tied to as well. They can then hold their developer or the person that sold them the house to task in terms of not meeting the contract that they have with them. So it's not a legal agreement between the council and the factor, but I think it's in all our interest to have that list of who are the factors and who are those that we could inform you as elected members and who you get in touch with around it. So yeah, we'll take that on board.
Councillor Frame.
Yeah, it was just a quick question. With the community growth, and I do believe that that's what all communities should have, are we taking into consideration the school situations? Our schools are mostly all at capacity, and we're bringing more houses in, and where these kids are going to go to school. Another question is also for GP surgeries and that roundabout in our communities, they're also at capacity with people struggling to get any appointments for the ones that are in the community just now without bringing anybody else into it. So have we looked into that fact, please?
Yeah, no, thanks, Councillor. In terms of the community growth area, then education provision is a requirement, and in terms of the East Kilbride one, there's a new primary school that's been created, as a result of the demand and the increase in the population in that area as well. We are in regular contact with colleagues within the education service, monitoring and looking at the capacity of schools. And where we can, and we do it in every opportunity, we'll take developer contributions to ensure that, that affordable housing as well as education provision is addressed through new developments coming into South Lanarkshire. Regarding the situation around doctors, then obviously that it tends to be the contracts of the doctor surgeries themselves, as well as through with the NHS. The provision of doctors, I think, affects existing and new communities, and is a challenge that I think that we all face, individually and as local authorities as well. It's not necessarily something that's directly related to the planning process that the planning process could resolve, but it's something we have to be conscious of as new developments come forward. But I must admit, it's a complex situation. It sits with the provision of health service and doctor surgeries and their personal contracts and the like as well. But it's something we're aware that colleagues within the Health and Social Care Partnership are seeking to address, but there isn't an easy solution.
Thank you, Fraser. And no further questions or comments. I would then like to propose a recommendation at 2.1 is to grant detailed plan permission based on conditions attached.
Second that.
All agreed? Agreed, thank you. Agenda item 10, page 99 in your pack, application P221507, and it's a site of the former fence nursery, Tillertudlium and in Lanark. Fraser?
Thanks, Chair. This application relates to the site of a former nursery outside the settlement boundary of Tillertudlium and seeks detailed consent for the erection of 5 dwelling houses. 12 letters of objection and 1 in support were submitted in relation to this application, and the details are summarised in section 5. With regards to the development planning assessment of the proposals, it is noted that it does not comply with national or local development plan policies, and as such is considered to be contrary to policies 14, 15 and 17 of the National Planning Framework. While the proposal to form 5 dwellings out with the defined settlement would also be contrary to policies 4, 5, GBRA 1 and GBRA 5 of the South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan, as the proposals would detrimentally impact on the character, amenity, traffic generation and landscape setting of this small rural settlement. Therefore, for the reasons set out in paragraph 7 and on page 106 of the committee papers, it is recommended that this application should be refused.
Thank you, Fraser. I'll open up for any questions or comments, please. If there is, Councillor Allison.
Yeah, just following on what's been said before, this is once again a site that can't be returned, if you like, or without great expense being returned to productive value, and is maybe a sign that whoever have been drawing settlement boundaries aren't compatible now with some of the planning regulations. So whether there is a process for doing that, which is re-looking at the next local plan, if you like, I think is there no way we can actually look to see how we can identify places which I would suggest this is one that might be more suitable rather than being left derelict until we can change other plans. Because I do not think that this one would be suitable for even light industrial use for access, and then therefore you're just going to get a derelict site.
Yeah, I think it's suggested, Councillor, it was through the local development planning processes where we would look to identify settlements without going into the nature of whether we'd redefine the boundary of Tillertudlium. Regarding the planning application that's presented here, there were issues in terms of the amenity, traffic generation and the landscape setting as well, so it wasn't just the policy consideration. So to extend the settlement boundary for this and for other settlement, there are a range of factors we want to take into consideration. The access road along to the settlement isn't fantastic by any means, and is that where we would want to encourage more traffic along through that site as well? Is there upgrades that we would need to do to the public road to make that site accessible? So these are all consideration that we would take into consideration through the review of the local development plan and the settlement boundaries. But that's an early stage of the local development plan because it needs to be part of the evidence report that we submit. So that's something that we'll be looking to present to the committee as an early stage of the LDP process. So hopefully that will identify opportunities for development, opportunities to promote rural regeneration and development in appropriate locations.
Thank you, Fraser. Councillor Shearer.
Thank you, Chair. Just to come on to what Fraser was commenting there. Fraser, I assume there will be a role for elected members in the early stages of putting the next local plan together, where we can discuss issues like this and others that we've discussed today, and hopefully come to a solution which would be more suitable for elected members and applicants. Is that going to happen? And if so, a timescale?
Yes,
Thanks.
no, it is, and I'll just let Fraser just update you, Councillor Shearer.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. Yeah, absolute engagement with elected members, local communities, with a commitment and a requirement to work with young people, with all aspects of the community. But the voice of local members we know is absolutely vital. And thankfully, we have a forum that allows us to have discussions out with the formality of the planning committee. So we want to engage with you, as the people who know your local areas better, and as much as we can. So we can do it through training, we can do it through individual events. You can also approach the planning officers directly through that whole LDP process. We only received the guidance last week from the Scottish Government about what should be involved in the preparation of local development plans. The guidance says they should be less wordy and map-based documents. So last week the guidance issued was a 244-page report that we now have to assess to tell us how to produce these less wordy and map-based documents. We'll need to get the formal approval of committee to start the local development plan process, and we're anticipating that that's going to be in August. That's when the formal discussion can start around that. But no, we are more than happy and actually really want to get the views of members about where you feel as if development could be appropriate. The plan will need to go through a long process about examination and consultation, and obviously the views formally through the committee as well as just as local representatives is something we want to take on board.
Thank you, Fraser. Any further questions or comments? No further questions or comments. I then propose the recommendation that we refuse detailed plan permission for the reasons stated.
Second it.
Everybody agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 11, page 109 is application P221768, and it's 2 Glenview Larkcall. Fraser again.
Thanks, Chair. This application seeks consent to extend an existing residential property to create a garage on the ground floor and a self-contained family accommodation on the first. It's been brought to the Planning Committee as 13 letters of objection were received against the proposal, the content of which is summarised in section 5 of the report. The proposal has been assessed against national and local development plan policies and is considered to be acceptable. In terms of the representations received, the submitted plans have been assessed, and it is considered that the impact on neighbouring properties from overshadowing privacy is acceptable, while the impact on the streetscape and the levels of the remaining garden ground are all acceptable. The applicant has also submitted information in relation to the use of the extended family accommodation and agreed to a condition that it should not be used or occupied as a separate dwelling unit. Therefore, subject to the conditions on page 115, it is recommended this application should be approved.
Thank you, Fraser. Open up for any questions or comments. If there is no question or comments, I then propose the recommendations to grant detailed plan permission subject to the conditions attached.
Second it.
All agreed? Agreed, thank you. Agenda item number 12 is page 117 in your pack, application P230241, Coburn and Lanark. Fraser?
Thanks, Chair. This application seeks consent under section 42 of the Planning Scotland Acts to vary a condition attached to a planning permission in principle that was approved in March 2020. The condition relates to structural planting that would need to be provided should this development of the site proceed, albeit that this would be subject to further applications which would in turn be presented to the Planning Committee. The application to amend the condition does not raise any adverse policy issues, and it is noted in paragraph 6.1 that in assessing submissions under section 42, the Planning Authority shall only consider the conditions subject to the planning permission that has been granted. Notwithstanding this, the proposal has been assessed against national and local development plan policies and is considered to be consistent with the ambitions of these plans, and therefore subject to the revised suite of conditions set out in pages 126 to 129, the application P230241 is recommended for approval.
Thank you, Fraser. I open up for any questions or comments. No questions or comments. I then propose the recommendation that this committee grants detailed plan permission based on the conditions attached.
Second it.
Everybody agreed? Agreed, thank you. Agenda item number 13 is page 131 in your pack, application P230257, is the sitting of a mobile snack van in East Kilbride. I'll ask Fraser to speak to it again.
Thanks, Chair. This application seeks consent for the siting of a mobile snack van within an established industrial area that has been subject to 8 letters of objection and therefore has been brought to the Planning Committee for determination. The proposal accords with the policies in the National Planning Framework and the Local Development Plan, and in particular policy DM13 of the adopted South Lanarkshire Local Development Plan. It is not considered that there will be any undue issues arising from the consent to site a van at this location, and that it represents an appropriate ancillary use in an industrial area. Therefore, subject to the conditions on pages 138 and 139, it is recommended that permission should be granted.
Thank you. I'll open up for any questions or comments. Councillor Watson.
Thanks, Chair. More an observation and maybe a question to Rhodes. I know the 5-year temporary approval for this, which is acceptable, and I'm assuming that's also on the basis of maybe further development that might take place in that area where there's some derelict land and there's been some interest shown. Probably to Rhodes, and I know no comment from Rhodes, but it is an industrial area, quite a bit of heavy traffic uses it, and my take is that this is not located in a lay-by, and are Rhodes confident that it will not cause any undue disruption to traffic movements within the area? If the vans there, plus parked vans, cars, etc., go to use the snack van. Thanks.
Thanks, David. I'll ask Fraser. Fraser.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Yes, we've measured the road width and are confident that it's wide enough to operate. In actual fact, the snack van has sat in a similar position previously and operated adequately, so we've got no issues.
Thank you. No further questions or comments? I will then propose to recommend that the committee grant detailed plan permission subject to the conditions attached.
Second it.
Everybody agreed? Agreed, thank you. Item 14, I do not have any items of urgent business, and I wish you all the very best for the rest of the day. Thank you.